In the humid summer of 1883, in the small Mississippi River town of Vicksburg, local authorities received an urgent telegram from a woman in Memphis, Tennessee, desperately seeking information about her daughter, who had been sent to a physician named Dr. Elias Crane for treatment of a minor respiratory ailment 6 months earlier, and had never returned home. The telegram was one of dozens that would eventually be received, all from families across multiple states, asking about children who had been placed in Dr. Crane's care and had subsequently vanished from contact with their loved ones. When Marshal Thomas Beckwith finally obtained a warrant to search Dr. Crane's medical clinic and residence on August 15, 1883, what he discovered would become one of the most disturbing medical scandals in post-Civil War America. The clinic, which Crane had operated since 1864, contained not the handful of patients that might be expected in a small-town medical practice, but 37 children ranging in age from 4 to 15 years old, all living in conditions that Marshal Beckwith would later describe as somewhere between a hospital ward and a prison. The children were housed in various rooms throughout the 3-story building that served as both Crane's clinic and personal residence. Some were confined to beds in what appeared to be treatment rooms. Others were locked in small chambers in the basement. Still others were found in attic spaces that had been converted into dormitories with rows of narrow cots. All the children showed signs of prolonged medical treatment, their bodies bearing the marks of repeated procedures, their behavior suggesting they had been subjected to a regime of control that went far beyond legitimate medical care. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the extensive documentation that authorities found in Crane's office. He had maintained meticulous records for 19 years, filling dozens of leather-bound journals with detailed notes about each child, their symptoms, the treatments he had administered, and the results he had observed. These records revealed that Crane had not been operating a medical practice in any conventional sense. He had been conducting long-term medical experiments on children whose families believed they were receiving short-term treatment for minor ailments, using the trust placed in him as a physician to gain access to vulnerable young patients whom he then kept for months or years, while subjecting them to procedures that served his research interests rather than their medical needs. Before we continue with the disturbing story of Dr. Elias Crane and the children he collected under the guise of medical care, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. Vicksburg, Mississippi in the 1860s and 1870s was a community still recovering from the trauma of the Civil War. The city had been under siege for 47 days during the summer of 1863, enduring constant bombardment that had destroyed much of its infrastructure and killed or displaced large portions of its population. When the war ended, Vicksburg faced the massive challenge of rebuilding, while also dealing with the social upheaval of Reconstruction, the integration of formerly enslaved people into society, and the economic disruption that came with the collapse of the plantation system. In this context of disruption and need, individuals who could provide essential services found themselves in high demand and often operated with minimal oversight. Physicians were particularly valuable, as the war and its aftermath had created enormous medical needs, while reducing the number of trained doctors available to serve communities. Many physicians had been killed in the war or had relocated to other regions. Those who remained found themselves overwhelmed with patients and facing medical challenges that went far beyond their training. Elias Crane had arrived in Vicksburg in early 1864, presenting himself as a trained physician who had served with Union Medical Corps during the war and was seeking to establish a practice in a community that desperately needed medical services. He was then 41 years old, a tall, thin man with precise manners and a somewhat cold demeanor that nevertheless inspired confidence in patients who appreciated what seemed like professional competence and scientific rigor. He spoke with authority about medical matters, claimed to have studied with prominent physicians in Philadelphia and Boston, and demonstrated familiarity with the latest medical theories and treatments. Crane rented a 3-story building on the edge of Vicksburg's commercial district and established both his residence and medical practice there. The location was somewhat isolated, set back from the main street with a small yard surrounded by a wooden fence that provided privacy from neighboring properties. This isolation would later prove significant, as it allowed Crane to conduct his activities with minimal observation from the community. For the first several years, Crane's practice appeared entirely conventional. He treated the typical range of ailments that afflicted residents of a Mississippi River town in the 1860s, from fevers and respiratory illnesses to injuries and chronic conditions. He delivered babies, set broken bones, prescribed medications, and performed minor surgeries. His fees were reasonable. He was available at irregular hours for emergencies, and he gradually built a reputation as a competent if somewhat impersonal physician who could be relied upon to provide adequate medical care. But by 1867 or 1868, something began to change in how Crane practiced medicine. He became increasingly interested in pediatric cases, in treating children rather than adults. He began offering his services specifically for childhood illnesses, advertising in local newspapers that he had special expertise in diseases of the young, and that parents should bring their sick children to him for evaluation and treatment. He also began offering to take children into his clinic for extended treatment, claiming that certain conditions required close monitoring and intensive interventions that couldn't be provided if the child remained at home. This shift toward pediatric medicine was not unusual in itself. Many physicians specialized in treating either adults or children, and parents often appreciated having access to a doctor who claimed particular expertise with young patients. What was unusual was Crane's insistence on keeping children at his clinic for extended periods, often for weeks or months longer than seemed necessary for the conditions they were supposedly being treated for. Crane would typically explain these extended stays by claiming that the child's condition was more serious than initially apparent, that complications had developed requiring additional treatment, or that the child needed continued observation to ensure full recovery. He would write letters to worried parents assuring them that their child was improving but was not yet ready to return home. He would provide medical explanations filled with technical terminology that many parents, particularly those without much education, found impressive and convincing even if they didn't fully understand what Crane was saying. The parents who entrusted their children to Crane's care came from various social and economic backgrounds, but most shared certain characteristics that made them vulnerable to his manipulations. Many were poor or working-class families who lacked the resources to provide intensive care at home for a sick child. Some were single parents or families where both parents worked and could not take time off to care for a seriously ill child. Others lived in rural areas far from Vicksburg and found it impractical to make frequent visits to check on a child who was supposedly receiving treatment. Crane also cultivated relationships with orphanages, churches, and charitable organizations that cared for children whose parents had died or who had been abandoned. He would offer to provide free or reduced-cost medical care to these institutions, presenting himself as a charitable physician who wanted to help society's most vulnerable children. The institutions, overwhelmed with children and lacking resources, were grateful for his offers and would send sick children to his clinic, often losing track of them once they entered Crane's care. By the early 1870s, Crane typically had between 15 and 25 children in his clinic at any given time, all supposedly receiving treatment for various medical conditions. The exact number fluctuated as some children were eventually discharged while others arrived for care. but Crane maintained a fairly consistent patient population that was unusually large for a single physician practicing in a town the size of Vicksburg. If anyone had been tracking his practice closely, this might have raised questions, but in the chaotic environment of post-war Mississippi, where record-keeping was poor and oversight was minimal, Crane's unusual practice pattern went largely unnoticed. What Crane was actually doing with these children would only become clear when authorities finally gained access to his clinic and records in 1883. His journals revealed that he had been conducting long-term medical experiments, testing various treatments and procedures on children who had no ability to consent and whose families had no idea what was actually being done to them. The children who came to him with minor respiratory infections, digestive problems, or other common childhood ailments became subjects in research protocols that Crane had designed to investigate questions about disease treatment and human physiology that interested him personally, but had no relevance to curing the conditions the children actually suffered from. Crane was particularly interested in testing the effects of various drugs and substances on children's developing bodies. He would administer different medications at varying doses and track the results, recording his observations about how the children responded. Some of these substances were standard medicines being used in legitimate medical practice, but Crane used them in ways that went beyond appropriate therapeutic use, giving higher doses or using combinations of drugs that were experimental and potentially dangerous. He also conducted procedures that had no legitimate medical justification. He would perform repeated blood draws on children, taking samples far more frequently than any diagnostic purpose would require. He would conduct physical examinations that were unnecessarily invasive. He would try various experimental surgical techniques on children whose conditions did not actually require surgery. All of this was documented in his journals with clinical precision, as if he were conducting scientific research rather than abusing the trust that families had placed in him. The psychological impact of Crane's treatment on the children was severe. They lived in a state of constant medical intervention, never knowing when they might be subjected to another procedure, another injection, another examination. They were told that everything being done to them was necessary for their treatment, that they were very sick and required intensive medical care, that they should be grateful for Dr. Crane's attention and expertise. Many of the children, particularly the younger ones, came to believe these explanations, internalizing the idea that there was something deeply wrong with them that required constant medical management. The older children, and those who had been in Crane's care longer, often understood at some level that something was wrong with their situation. They recognized that they had been at the clinic far longer than seemed necessary, that they were subjected to procedures that seemed to have no purpose, that Dr. Crane's interest in them went beyond what would be expected of a physician simply trying to cure an illness. But they had no power to resist or escape, no way to communicate with their families, and no one to turn to for help. Crane maintained strict control over the children's contact with the outside world. Letters from worried parents were answered by Crane himself, who would write reassuring messages claiming to speak for the child, explaining that the child was too weak to write personally, but was improving steadily under his care. Parents who attempted to visit were often turned away, with Crane claiming that the child was sleeping, undergoing treatment, or that visitors might interfere with the healing process. The few parents who did manage to see their children found them thin and subdued, but were told by Crane that this was normal for children recovering from serious illnesses. The isolation that Crane imposed on the children served multiple purposes. It prevented families from discovering what was actually being done to their children. It eliminated any external validation that might help children understand that their treatment was abnormal. And it created an environment where Crane had absolute authority, where no one could question his decisions or challenge his methods, where he could pursue his research interests without interference or accountability. By the late 1870s, some families had begun to grow seriously concerned about children who had been in Crane's care for months or years with no clear timeline for recovery and discharge. A few had attempted to remove their children from his clinic, only to be told by Crane that doing so would be medically dangerous, that the child's treatment was at a critical stage, that premature discharge could result in relapse or death. These warnings, delivered with Crane's authoritative medical tone, were usually sufficient to convince worried families to leave their children in his care, at least for a while longer. But some families were not satisfied with Crane's explanations. A woman named Rebecca Walsh, whose 9-year-old son had been sent to Crane for treatment of a fever in early 1881 and was still at the clinic 2 years later, began writing letters to various authorities asking for help in getting her son back. Her letters described a pattern of evasion and delay on Crane's part, his refusal to allow her to visit her son except under strict supervision, and his vague explanations about why the boy still needed treatment after so much time. Walsh's letters eventually reached Thomas Beckwith, a U.S. Marshal who had been assigned to investigate various complaints about civil rights violations and exploitation of vulnerable people in the Reconstruction South. Beckwith was initially skeptical, as he received many complaints that turned out to be misunderstandings or family disputes rather than actual crimes. But as he looked into Walsh's claims and discovered that several other families had made similar complaints about Dr. Crane, he began to suspect that something more serious might be occurring. Beckwith's investigation was hampered by Crane's status as a respected physician and by the difficulty of obtaining evidence about what was happening inside his clinic. Crane was known in the community as a professional medical practitioner, and suggesting that he might be engaged in criminal activity required substantial proof. Beckwith spent several months gathering testimony from families, consulting with other physicians about whether Crane's treatment protocols seemed appropriate, and attempting to establish grounds for obtaining a search warrant. The breakthrough came when one of Crane's patients, a 13-year-old girl named Elizabeth, managed to escape from the clinic in July of 1883. She had been held there for nearly 3 years, supposedly receiving treatment for a respiratory condition that her mother had believed was serious. Elizabeth had been looking for an opportunity to leave for months, and when she found an unlocked door during a night when Crane was absent from the building, she ran. Elizabeth made her way to a neighbor's house and told a story that shocked those who heard it. She described living in the clinic with dozens of other children, all supposedly receiving medical treatment, but actually being used by Dr. Crane for purposes she didn't fully understand. She described repeated examinations and procedures, medications that made her feel sick, blood draws that left her weak and dizzy, and a regime of control that kept all the children in a state of fear and compliance. She described other children who had died while in Crane's care, their bodies removed from the clinic in the night, with no explanation provided to the surviving children about what had happened to them. Elizabeth's testimony provided Marshal Beckwith with the evidence he needed to obtain a search warrant. On August 15, 1883, accompanied by local law enforcement and several physicians, Beckwith arrived at Crane's clinic with legal authority to enter the building and search for evidence of criminal activity. Crane initially refused entry, claiming that the search would disturb his patients and interfere with medical treatment. But when Beckwith threatened to break down the door, Crane reluctantly allowed the authorities inside. What they found over the next several hours of searching would shock the community and lead to one of the most significant medical scandals of the post-war era. The building contained 37 children in various states of health, ranging from those who appeared relatively well to others who were clearly seriously ill, from causes that had nothing to do with the conditions they had supposedly come to Crane to treat. The children were housed throughout the building, some in rooms that resembled hospital wards, others in spaces that looked more like cells than medical treatment areas. In the basement, investigators found what appeared to be an experimental laboratory, with medical equipment, shelves of bottled substances, and detailed charts tracking various measurements and observations. Crane had created a space for conducting systematic research, complete with tools for performing procedures, storage for specimens, and work areas for recording data. The basement also contained several small rooms, where children had apparently been isolated, either for observation or as punishment for resistance to treatment. The attic had been converted into a dormitory, with rows of narrow beds, minimal furnishings, and barred windows that prevented escape. This was where many of the children slept, under conditions that were closer to institutional confinement than to medical care. The children who were housed in the attic showed signs of neglect, their clothing worn and inadequate, their bodies thin from poor nutrition, their behavior suggesting they had been living under harsh discipline and minimal supervision. Most damning were the records that Beckwith found in Crane's office. The physician had maintained extraordinarily detailed journals, documenting every aspect of his practice since 1864, recording the arrival of each child, their presenting symptoms, the treatments he had administered, and the results he had observed. These journals revealed the systematic nature of Crane's abuse, showing that he had been deliberately conducting long-term experiments on children for nearly 2 decades, using the trust placed in him as a physician to gain access to vulnerable subjects, whom he then exploited for his own research interests. The journals also documented deaths. Crane had recorded the deaths of at least 43 children, who had been in his care over the 19 years he had operated his clinic. Some of these deaths might have been from natural causes, or legitimate complications of the illnesses the children had arrived with, but many showed patterns suggesting they had resulted from Crane's experimental treatments, from adverse reactions to drugs he had administered, from complications of unnecessary procedures he had performed, or from the cumulative effects of prolonged abuse and neglect. Crane had documented these deaths with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else, noting the circumstances, the symptoms the child had displayed before death, and his hypothesis about what had caused the death. He showed no remorse or reflection on his responsibility for these deaths, treating them simply as data points in his ongoing research, as unfortunate but inevitable outcomes of experimental work. The physicians who accompanied Marshal Beckwith examined the surviving children and found evidence of extensive medical abuse. Many children showed signs of malnutrition, despite supposedly receiving medical care. Others had multiple puncture marks on their arms from repeated blood draws. Several had surgical scars from procedures that appeared to have no legitimate medical purpose. All showed psychological trauma consistent with prolonged abuse and control. Dr. Elias Crane was arrested on August 15, 1883, and charged with multiple counts of assault, false imprisonment, manslaughter, and practicing medicine in a manner that violated professional standards and ethics. The 37 children found in his clinic were removed and placed in the care of various charitable institutions and families, while arrangements could be made for returning them to their own families when possible. Many of these children had been in Crane's care so long that tracking down their original families proved difficult, and some were never reunited with their relatives. The trial of Dr. Elias Crane began in January of 1884 and attracted national attention. The prosecution presented testimony from surviving children about their experiences in his clinic, medical evidence documenting the harm that had been done to them, and Crane's own journals showing his deliberate conduct of experiments on human subjects without consent. The case seemed overwhelming, a clear example of a physician who had violated every principle of medical ethics and used his position to exploit vulnerable children for his own purposes. But Crane's defense attorneys mounted a vigorous defense that revealed troubling questions about medical practice, professional autonomy, and the limits of physician authority. They argued that Crane had been conducting legitimate medical research, that experimentation was necessary for advancing medical knowledge, and that the methods he had used, while perhaps aggressive, were not fundamentally different from practices employed by physicians at major medical institutions. They pointed out that medical research often involved risks to patients, and that progress in treating disease required doctors to try new approaches that might not always succeed. The defense also argued that many of the children's families had consented to treatment, that they had entrusted their children to Crane's care, and that this consent gave him broad authority to make medical decisions about treatment protocols. They suggested that Crane had been attempting to cure serious illnesses, that his extended retention of patients reflected the severity of their conditions rather than any improper motive, and that the deaths that had occurred were unfortunate, but inevitable consequences of treating very sick children. This defense strategy attempted to blur the lines between legitimate medical practice and the systematic abuse that Crane had actually engaged in. It suggested that physician authority was so broad that it encompassed the right to conduct long-term experiments on patients without their knowledge or consent, that parents' trust in doctors implied acceptance of whatever procedures the doctor deemed appropriate, and that medical research justified practices that would be considered criminal in any other context. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the deception involved in Crane's practice, his deliberate misleading of families about what he was doing to their children, and the extensive documentation showing that he had been pursuing his own research interests, rather than trying to cure the children's actual illnesses. They brought in medical experts who testified that Crane's practices violated established standards of care, that many of the procedures he had performed were not justified by the children's conditions, and that no legitimate physician would have operated in the manner Crane had. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with the jury hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses, including surviving children, their families, medical experts, and investigators who had searched Crane's clinic. The defense presented character witnesses who attested to Crane's professional reputation, and expert witnesses who argued that medical research required flexibility and that restricting physician discretion too much would impede scientific progress. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a mixed verdict. They found Crane guilty of false imprisonment and assault, but acquitted him of the more serious charges of manslaughter, apparently accepting the defense argument that the deaths of children in his care could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt to have been caused by his actions, rather than by their underlying illnesses. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence that many observers felt was inadequate, given the scope and duration of his crimes. Crane served 8 years before being released in 1892. He was prohibited from practicing medicine and required to register his address with authorities, but beyond these restrictions, he was allowed to live freely. He moved to New Orleans, where he worked as a medical consultant for various businesses, advising on health and safety matters, but not treating patients directly. He died in 1898, at age 75, never expressing public remorse for what he had done, and maintaining in his final years that his research had been valuable and would eventually be recognized as contributing to medical knowledge. The 37 children rescued from Crane's clinic faced difficult recoveries. Medical authorities attempted to reverse some of the physical harm that had been done to them, treating malnutrition and infections, allowing their bodies to recover from the procedures they had been subjected to. The younger children generally recovered better physically, their bodies more resilient and capable of healing from the abuse. Older children, particularly those who had been in Crane's care for many years, experienced more lasting physical effects. The psychological recovery was even more difficult. The children struggled with trust issues, with fear of physicians and medical settings, with confusion about what had been done to them and why. Many had internalized Crane's explanations that they were sick and needed constant medical treatment, and they had difficulty understanding that this had been a lie, that they had been used for experiments rather than receiving legitimate care. Some developed anxiety and depression that persisted throughout their lives. Others managed to build relatively normal lives, but carried trauma that affected their relationships and their sense of safety in the world. Several of the children were eventually returned to their families, though these reunions were often difficult. Parents struggled with guilt about having placed their children in Crane's care, about having trusted a physician who had betrayed that trust so completely. The children had changed during their time in the clinic, had become more withdrawn and fearful, and re-establishing normal family relationships required time and patience that not all families could provide. Other children could not be reunited with their families. Some had no living relatives, having been orphans when they came to Crane's clinic. Others had families that could not be located despite the efforts of authorities. These children were placed in orphanages or with foster families, but their experiences in Crane's clinic left them with challenges that made stable placements difficult. Several moved between multiple foster homes, never finding a permanent place where they felt secure. The Crane case led to significant reforms in medical regulation and oversight in Mississippi, and eventually in other states as well. The state medical board established stricter licensing requirements for physicians, created mechanisms for investigating complaints about medical practice, and developed ethical guidelines that explicitly prohibited the kinds of experimental practices Crane had engaged in. Hospitals and clinics were required to maintain better records of their patients and to allow for inspections by authorities. These reforms were important steps toward protecting patients from medical abuse, but they were imperfect and incompletely implemented. Many physicians resisted oversight, arguing that it interfered with their professional autonomy and judgment. Medical boards were often composed of physicians who were reluctant to discipline their peers too harshly, and the reforms did little to address the fundamental power imbalance between physicians and patients, the trust that patients placed in doctors, and the vulnerability that this trust created. The case also contributed to broader national conversations about medical ethics and the boundaries of legitimate research. The late 19th century was a period of rapid medical advancement, with new treatments and procedures being developed at an unprecedented rate. Much of this progress came from experimentation and research that pushed the boundaries of accepted practice. The question of where to draw the line between legitimate innovation and unethical experimentation was complex and contested. Some physicians and medical researchers argued that Crane's error was not in conducting experiments on human subjects, but in being too aggressive and careless in his methods. They suggested that with proper safeguards, experimental medical research on children and other vulnerable populations could be conducted ethically and could contribute to advancing medical knowledge. Others argued that the Crane case demonstrated why experimentation on human subjects, particularly on vulnerable populations like children, should be strictly prohibited, or at least heavily regulated. These debates would continue throughout the 20th century, as other cases of unethical medical research came to light, and as society struggled to develop frameworks for protecting research subjects, while still allowing for medical progress. The Crane case became a reference point in these discussions, an example of what could happen when physicians had unlimited authority over vulnerable patients, and when the pursuit of knowledge was not balanced against ethical obligations to avoid harm. The physical site of Crane's clinic was demolished in 1885, with community members feeling that the building was too associated with horror to be used for any purpose. The lot remained vacant for many years before eventually being developed for other uses. There is no marker or memorial to indicate what once stood on that site, or to commemorate the children who suffered there, but the case itself remains in historical records, in medical journals that analyzed what Crane had done and debated its implications, in legal records of his trial, and in the memoirs and testimonies of survivors. It serves as a case study in medical abuse of power, a reminder of what can happen when professional authority is exercised without adequate oversight or accountability, and evidence of the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit them under the guise of providing care. The story of Dr. Elias Crane and the children he collected under the guise of medical treatment forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, authority, and vulnerability. Parents who brought their sick children to Crane did so because they trusted that physicians would act in their patients' best interests, that medical professionals would use their knowledge and skills to heal rather than to harm. Crane systematically violated that trust, using his position to gain access to vulnerable children whom he then exploited for his own purposes. The case also raises questions about how we balance the need for medical research and innovation against the ethical obligation to protect research subjects from harm. Medical progress often requires trying new treatments and procedures, testing hypotheses about disease and healing. But this pursuit of knowledge must be constrained by ethical principles that prioritize the welfare of patients, that require genuine informed consent, and that prohibit experimentation that serves the researcher's interests rather than the patient's needs. The reforms that followed the exposure of Crane's practices were important steps, but history shows that they were not sufficient to prevent future cases of medical abuse. Throughout the 20th century, other physicians and researchers would be discovered conducting unethical experiments on vulnerable populations, from the Tuskegee syphilis study to various cases of experimental procedures performed on institutionalized children and adults. Each case would lead to calls for stronger protections and better oversight, but the fundamental challenges would remain. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of the Crane case is the recognition that professional authority and credentials do not guarantee ethical behavior, that physicians, like all people, are capable of exploiting power when that power is exercised without accountability. Protecting vulnerable people requires more than trusting that professionals will do the right thing. It requires systems of oversight, mechanisms for reporting and investigating abuse, and a willingness to believe and support those who come forward with allegations of harm. The children who survived Crane's clinic carried the effects of their experiences throughout their lives. Some managed to heal, to build families and careers, to find meaning and satisfaction despite the trauma they had endured. Others struggled with chronic physical and mental health problems that traced back to their time under Crane's control. All were marked by the knowledge that someone they had been taught to trust, someone society told them would help and heal them, had instead used them for his own purposes, with no regard for their suffering or their futures. What do you think about this case? What protections do we need to prevent physicians from abusing their authority? How can patients and families recognize when medical treatment has crossed the line into experimentation or abuse? What responsibilities do medical professionals have to police their own ranks? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried, it's just waiting in the shadows.